And we're back now with our weekly News to You segment, remembering when the Jerry Lewis MDA Telethon was a huge staple of Labor Day television here, a deadly tornado near Batavia, and the late David Bowie rocking the odd. It all made news this very week. In decades past, Dave McKinley brings us back to a time when it was all news to you.
10 years ago this week.
Walk inside this local business in South Buffalo and you'll learn all about a new trend called vaping. And business is promoted as a healthy alternative to smoking. But the Center for Disease Control and Prevention says the health effects are not clear yet because it's a new product. They are currently not regulated by the Federal Drug Administration.
Well, in the 10 years since the CDC has determined vaping isn't healthy, the FDA does now regulate it, and New York State drove many vape shops out of business by banning flavored vapes, the types which you could buy this week in 2013. 20 years ago this week, and just shy of the second anniversary of 9/11, the first group of airline pilots chosen for a new program aimed at stopping hijackers completed their training. This week's News to You pop quiz: what do you think that new training for that new program involved, and from which the first few pilots graduated this week in 2003. The news wasn't all melancholy, though. Why, this was also when two brand new medical studies came out, the first to conclude that dark chocolate and red wine were actually good for your health, in moderation.
Cheers.
Holy mackerel, awash in wine and chocolate, life was perhaps never much better than it was this week in 2003. 30 years ago this week.
And we're just going to not look back and go forward.
Choking back tears amid his fall from grace, Francis Giles pled guilty to misappropriating government funds, ending the career of one of the most popular sheriffs to ever hold that office in Niagara County. Meanwhile, in Genesee County,
I never seen nothing like it.
When a tornado touched down in Batavia with enough force to lift two trucks traveling on Route 5 and place them in each other's paths, resulting in the deaths of two men. At the time, the radar at the National Weather Service office in Buffalo wasn't sophisticated enough to detect it.
We're hoping that the new Doppler radar that will be installed here in another year and a half will be able to see that activity and give us forewarning.
Back then, the tears always flowed as the tote board totals climbed for Jerry's kids. At the annual Muscular Dystrophy Telethon, we at Channel 2 were doing our part as the local hosts of the event, once a staple of Labor Day weekend television. Kids returned to classes where the DARE program still existed in 75% of schools, and Richard Simmons was still at the height of his popularity, drawing many to malls this week in 1993. 40 years ago this week, the Bills opened their season with a shutout loss to the Dolphins. Joe Ferguson started at quarterback as a certain first-round draft pick had stiffed Buffalo for the USFL. They'd work that out later. The Bills' other first-round pick was with the team, but Tony Hunter would play only a few seasons, his career cut short by injury. Their second-round pick, though, young Darryl Talley, went on to star for 12 seasons for the Red, White, and Blue. The Bisons were still playing at the Rock Pile. David Bowie was playing at Memorial Auditorium. And speaking of music, while CDs were on the market, most of us back then still listened to albums on vinyl, on a stereo with a turntable on top, back in the days when it was all news to you.
Oh boy, the memories, Maria, right? I know. Well, here's the answer to this week's News to You pop quiz about the new type of training airline pilots were receiving 20 years ago back in 2003. It was in the carrying and use of firearms aboard planes. You may remember at the time, we were just 2 years removed from 9/11, and it was seen as a last line of defense against any possible hijackers. The voluntary training program still exists to this day, but the number of pilots who have been trained and who may be packing on flights is classified information.